Dear listeners, you have just heard an excerpt from Giacomo Meyerbeer's opera, Les Huguenots, the Huguenots. That's Act 4. That is an excerpt in French. Dieu le veut, il le faut. God wants it, therefore it must be done. It's a really stunning kind of denunciation of religious fundamentalism, interscene strife. And yes, of course, the recording sounds old, which it is, 50 plus years. They are very difficult to come by. It's a sign of the near total erasure of Meyerbeer and his work from opera houses around the world, recording studios. It is very difficult, in short, to easily sit and hear a Meyerbeer opera played in opera houses around the world. Whereas Wagner and Wagner's Ring remains a kind of touchstone as a high point, high watermark of achievement. So Los Angeles Opera, right, sets tens of millions of dollars to putting on a ring cycle. When they do so using Wagner's Ring music, and Meyerbeer remains largely forgotten, despite the fact that in his own day, Meyerbeer was a commanding titan of the stage, a fact that made Wagner extremely jealous and, of course, bruised his sensitive ego. And in many ways, Wagner set out, right, like a rebellious child, to do exactly the opposite of his mentor and musical stepfather, Meyerbeer. And in many ways, Meyerbeer is the antithesis of Wagner, right? He goes for studies in powerlessness rather than paeans to power. He's very much concerned with human history rather than mythology, right? And even in the excerpt you just heard, yes, he speaks of the words of hatred and discrimination, yes, how Catholics call the Calvinists sorcerers, speaking of damnation, of death to resistance. He really puts you on a granular level into the events of history as they unfold. And I think he's really asking for people to be witnesses, to rethink how strife and how scapegoating mechanisms in particular come back time and again and raise their ugly head into history, and more often than not are related to some kind of fundamentalist belief system, yes, that can always raise the prospect of bigotry and fuel propaganda, right? So if you say that Wagner is a kind of allegorist of fantasy, Meyerbeer is an archaeologist of modernity here. And the Huguenots is, of course, a tale of religious discrimination, maybe the most iconic case of persecution and massacre of a religious minority, right? The ultimate expulsion and removal of the Protestants from France. And right, clearly Meyerbeer would not have been so far from his own thinking, his own status, right, as a member of the Jewish minority in Europe, right, against whom more and more animus was on the rise. And of course, Wagner, this new ideology of scapegoating, of anti-Semitism, which could be used as a kind of philosopher's stone to unlock the mysteries of the complexities of the modern world, to understand the turbulent, tumultuous changes wrought by modernity and an increasingly globalized world. So Meyerbeer is really making consciousness-raising works like the Huguenots. And just to give you a final example, before you tune in, hopefully, to the second half, the continuing part of a lecture on Wagner and Meyerbeer, Meyerbeer's final swan song, his final opera, was titled L'Africaine, so the feminine form, an African woman, yes, of an African woman, a queen facing colonization by European explorers. And so sensitively does he really put himself empathetically into the shoes of this African woman, right? Long before and hardly ever since has there been such a leading role, and so finely and carefully wrought, that puts an African woman front and center into a European opera. So at the end of his life in the 1860s, right, as colonization, as imperialism ever more clearly begins to change the shape of the world, Meyerbeer sets out a story, right, of empathy for these other cultures who are being colonized by Europeans. So thank you, and please enjoy the second half of the lecture on Meyerbeer and Wagner. From the beginning to the end, it's Wotan, right, the king of the gods, based on Odin from Norse mythology, and then Alberich. And remember, you could almost argue that Alberich is the more significant figure. The entire work is named after him. It's the Ring of the Nibelungen. Alberich is a Nibelung, which is this, I hesitate to use the word race. It's essentially a clan of dwarfs who live underground. And there are two basic dynamics at work. I mean, first of all, you have the idea of, love for money, the idea of the attraction to gold, right? Gold stands for wealth, riches, money, and that people are willing to give up love to get money, right? Which is one of probably the most fundamental critique of capitalism that we have available. The idea that capitalism pushes people to prioritize money over love. And the second point, though, as you saw, really has to do with greed. The idea that it's not just money is not enough, it's more and more. It's accumulation, right? It's about accumulation of money. And we see that in the sense that, first of all, Wotan has this palace-built Valhalla that could be, you could look at it as a plantation house, as an empire, and that basically, first of all, he doesn't want to pay for it, And then when he finds a way to steal from someone else to pay for it, he wants to steal that back, right? The ring from Alberich, ultimately the giants, and he condemns his whole family in that pursuit, and it's his grandson Siegfried ultimately fights the giant to get it back. I really do think because it's so complicated, there are no slides at the moment. I'm just trying to review the summary with you. Because it's so complicated, I want to open the floor to questions. So let me, on behalf of you, call up, I really am not providing with you a full detailed plot summary, but I do want to give you the broad outlines. So first of all, are there any questions? I just thought, we're a little past the middle point of class today. I just wanted to take a break because it is very complex, even just to talk about in an overview. And briefly, if you have any specific things you might be confused about, please let us know now.
Sorry, I have a point to share.
Yes, go ahead.
Because you have mentioned the protagonists, the main characters, but I think one point that can sort of compare Wagner's the Ring cycle to Marxian theory is that actually the Ring is the protagonist, I think, in my opinion.
Okay.
And it is the importance, the conflicts, all the chasing of the Ring actually embodies the sort of ironically embodies the capitalist thinking, the capitalist belief of chasing the wealth, chasing the money. And at the same time, it seems that every plot and characters are developed from the Ring. So it's sort of, Wagner has emphasized the importance of the Ring as the protagonist of the whole opera, instead of being just a symbol or a sign that links up all the characters and the plots. It is my opinion.
That's great, Jason. I really like that. I also like, because this is a very nice, close reading of it. You're bringing us back to the actual evidence as it's presented. Why? Because as you basically allude to, the title of the work is Der Ring des Nibelungen. I'm just going to take issue with one small point, if I may, because remember that there is no ring at first. What there is there's the gold under the water, okay, in the Rhine River. And, we should probably, the music is also very special because it's an arpeggiated E-flat chord, which it sounds like creation of the world / underwater music. And it opens up to these basically almost mermaids who are swimming around this gold. So at first there's no gold. In order to have gold, you become a ring, you need industrial production, okay? And it's the Nibelungen who actually do the factory work to make the gold a ring. I want to play that music, partially because I think, like, we're talking about Industrial Revolution. I don't think that, to my knowledge, there's, in the history of modern art music, there's no case of a better soundtrack to what a factory sounds like. And Wagner actually uses anvils, like a blacksmith's tools, to create this music. I think that this is a good clip, but we're going to give it a try. I have a few different ones here. So let's give it a try. And this, by the way, is the music of the Nibelheim, which is like the underground world of the Nibelungen.
I'm sorry, Professor. I don't think there's sounds coming from the video.
You don't see the video?
We can see the video, but not the sound.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'm trying again because I hear the sound. That's very strange. Let me try it again. I'm going to try it one more time. Try it again.
Now we can hear it.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop that. That gives you at least a sense of it. First of all, that is also an effective clip because it shows you the through drama, the principle. Essentially, you have a kind of a visitation of the underworld. That visualization from that production shows that well. And maybe in a traditional grand opera, you would break the scene. But Wagner actually writes this transformation music, which kind of takes you on a journey as if you're still in the world, so the drama doesn't break. And then you have this, interesting kind of industrial sound to it as well. Yes, go ahead.
So could I say that there is like a sense of the spirits of realism in Wagner's opera? Although he's like using all these mythologies and something, but like in the way he uses those industrial parts, I'm not sure what the name of that thing was, and also the way how he designs his theater. Is there like a sense, a spirit of realism in his opera setting?
Wait, can you explain why would you use the term realism? Like, what are you thinking of that you choose to use the word realism?
Because like in realism, like in Charles Dickens, like the what
Right.
writers were doing were trying to depict facts in life and trying to reflect on some of the like inequalities or problems in the society. And Wagner is kind of like doing the same thing with his opera, but like I wouldn't say like Wagner is a realism guy, but I feel like there is a sense of realism in his work.
It's interesting, Daniel. It's a very interesting because normally, I mean, I understand your point when you mentioned Dickens, but normally one would look at Wagner as the antithesis of realism, the opposite of realism, because he transforms his settings into a completely magical, other, different world. And remember, like we showed, it has people traveling through the earth underground. We know that that's not real, right? No little dwarfs live under the ground in the earth. Also, these dwarfs make a magic ring that can control the world, or later a magic helmet or a magic sword. All of this is fantasy. It's not realist at all. I think, though, that you might be referring perhaps more on the psychological, personal level. And another way that Wagner is often interpreted, which we haven't mentioned, is psychoanalytically, like using Jung, archetypes about psychology and motivation. In that sense, it's very, I would say, more truthful. Like there's psychological truth in Wagner more than realism, so to speak, in the sense that he very much reflects actual, we talked about greed, lust, accumulation. There's more psychological truth than realism, also because remember that realism is actually a genre of art. I mean, as you well described, popular in the 19th century, more so in literature and art. You know, if we think of Courbet in French painting, or Rapin in Russian painting, where they're almost documentarians, right? It's realism as a genre of documenting reality. Wagner clearly, he never actually, not one of his works was ever based in a real European setting of the 19th century, never. He did one historical opera set in medieval Germany, but the interesting thing is that it was actually a comedy, his only comedy, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, the Master Singers of Nuremberg. So in the strict aesthetic sense, Wagner was not a realist, but I do think you're onto something, that he engages with psychological truths. And in that sense, Wagner was very, very contemporary and very much modern as well.
Because like they both happen like around the same century, I think. And like they are also kind of like a response to the industrialization in Europe. So I thought it would be like a interesting comparison of them.
Right. It is an interesting comparison for sure. I think, though, that realism is actually, as a genre, doesn't quite have the same musical counterpoint the way that Romanticism does, etc. Usually, we don't think in terms of music. Realism is not usually used as a formal term, right? So the debate, which is what we talked about last week with E.T.A. Hoffman, if you go back and read that article, which is very short, it's only like 10 or 12 pages, he talks about absolute versus programmatic music, right? So in music, we talk about absolute or programmatic. In other words, music that, like we talked about the symphonic poem, that's the ultimate genre of programmatic music, where it actually tries to illustrate a visual text, right? So when we're talking about realism, usually that means that the illustration of a visual text, whereas absolute music means non-referential. There's no referential. And I think what you're talking about is you're really talking about referentiality, not realism. So it's true, right? Nibelheim is depicted as a factory with a blacksmith's tools, but it's still a fantasy. It's not real. It's just referentiality within a fantasy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we don't have that much time, so we still have quite a bit to cover. Let us go back to our slides. Okay. And I think, this is a great point, because if you take a look here at what I was trying to kind of allude to, the idea that, all of the fantasy elements have a kind of allegorical or symbolic or referential quality that, I'll give you another example. The spear, Wotan has a spear upon which is inscribed the law of his realm. In the same way that, in fact, what the revolution of 1848 was fighting for was to have a constitution, have the law be written down, not arbitrary, that the king can decide whatever he wants to do, that's it. No, you need it written down, okay? And you'll notice that the main dispute, which is really starts between the giants. And the giants, you can think of, it's interesting, you could think of them as like big factory workers, right? That the dwarfs are sort of the Weberei, the handheld people. And the giants, like if you just think of productive capacity, right? We know that giants don't exist, right? Unless you believe in Bigfoot. But basically the giants mean, people who can do big factories. The dwarfs are the handheld people, the Weberei. And there's a contractual dispute, right? And without going off into Marx too much, Marx has this concept of profit, right? Surplus value, that essentially the capitalist tries to extract more value than the labor itself is worth, right? So that the worker will be paid for their services, but what the worker actually produces is worth more than they'll be paid, right? And that surplus is the profit. And you'll see that essentially, Wotan tries to cheat out the giants almost entirely of their, of course, this magical gold is the ultimate profit because it brings power. And that's really, I think, why Wagner is very special, and in a way sometimes can even go deeper than Marx, because he's talking about power beyond profit, the idea that essentially a certain kind of accumulation of wealth also gives power over the entire society. Not just, okay, I have a little bit more money, in my bank account, but I can actually rule over people. It's a new form of rule based on profit, which of course is something that's unique to the capitalist era, because you do not have production of scale that creates the levels of profit that capitalist production unleashes. But the basic point before we move on with Wagner is that what he's doing is he's bringing the revolution of 1848, but instead he is realizing it through a musical revolution. Wagner was a musical revolutionary, and that's very similar to Beethoven. We talked about how Beethoven crushed the classical form. He totally remade the symphony with a new technology. So parallel to Beethoven, he made a revolution in music, and Wagner did the same with Marx, using, as you see, powerful architecture, special effects. In that sense, he's absolutely a musical revolutionary, paradoxically, in the fact that he uses this very ancient primal mythology. Okay. Now, there's a lot that can be said here, and we're going to talk briefly before we end on Meyerbeer, is we're going to talk about, Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm sure you've heard of him, the famous line, "God is dead," the Übermensch. Schopenhauer, a less well-known philosopher, but the European philosopher of the 19th century who more than any other was really interested in Asian philosophy, Buddhism in particular. He really was somewhat of a scholar on Buddhist philosophy, and he brought in a way, Buddhist thought into European philosophy. And there is a connection to Marx and Wagner. Later, Wagner was very much an adherent to Schopenhauer's idea. If we think of the Buddha and the middle way, and we think of the idea that like material existence is an illusion, Maya, that there's suffering, primary, because ultimately the story of the ring is this rise and fall of an empire, that this pursuit by Wotan is all for naught, and he condemns his whole family, and ultimately he destroys his world, right? Because of his pursuit. And this kind of almost like negationism of the world is something that is very Buddhist, it's very Schopenhauerian. And Wagner's last work that I'll just mention briefly, Parsifal, is all about renunciation. Now, Parsifal is very much a Christian work about the second coming of Jesus Christ, but it's put in Buddhist, modernist European terms. Now, just to the reading that you have on the syllabus for Schopenhauer is really about the importance of music itself. And this continues, this is like a late romantic version of E.T.A. Hoffmann, right? We read last week Hoffmann and Beethoven, and Schopenhauer very much continues this idea that kind of music is this special road to the will. Well, first of all, Nietzsche, who actually was an ancient Greek specialist, he was a philologist, and he wrote a lot of work on, he did a lot of work on Wagner, knew him personally. Nietzsche did collapse into mental illness the last 10 years of his life, and he had a kind of awakening. He had a kind of break up, crash with Wagner. He was a much younger man. He was very enamored of Wagner's works. And in his first major text, The Birth of Tragedy, he basically says Wagner's bringing back Greek tragedy. And Wagner's like the greatest thing to happen. And then gradually he realizes, Wagner is actually, he's a kind of vile nationalist, racist, commercialist. Like Wagner is a kind of, he is a decadent, kitschy, capitalist wheeler dealer. And he changes his mind because of the theater, because of the Bayreuth Theater and the Bayreuth Festival. And he sees, no, like Wagner is essentially just adding to the problem. He's not bringing back tragedy and Greek tragedy. No, he's basically adding more of this kind of cultic, neurotic entertainment. Nietzsche, in his own way, from a philosophical point of view, believes that some kind of spiritual revolution is necessary to emancipate people, but that especially when Wagner starts to embrace Schopenhauer, Nietzsche sees this as decadent. It's sort of passive. And what is decadence? And this is the term Nietzsche uses. Our unit in 2 units, we're going to talk about degeneration, which is a more scientific post-Darwin idea of decadence. But for our purposes and for Nietzsche, decadence in this period, he describes it, Wagner, it's a neurosis, it's sickening, it's brutal, artificial, and innocence in the sense of like immature, childlike. Essentially that, Wagner's music, it's kind of unhealthy. It's brutal, but it's also kind of fake. This is the critique of Nietzsche. Later, there's early and later Nietzsche. But Schopenhauer, who, Wagner himself, even though, he never really embraced Nietzsche as much as Schopenhauer, basically says, look, music is the closest we're going to get to what's really true, the will, what's underneath everything. And Schopenhauer, in your very brief reading, it's only a few pages, says an unconscious exercise. Music is an unconscious exercise in arithmetic in which the mind does not know it is counting, right? Like, almost like music is this special magical world akin to the kind of magical world that Wagner creates in The Ring. Another quote from Schopenhauer, music is the image of the will itself. It constitutes the essence, right? The will, think of it as like the essence of what really exists. We're going to end with a comparison, a kind of comparison critique, because much later, we will spend a long time later on in the next month talking about fascism, totalitarianism, Nazism, Stalinism in the 20th century. And one of the things that we will grapple with, of course, is the use of music by the Nazis and racism that leads to genocide. Now, Wagner himself, of course, dies in 1883, right? He basically dies around the same time Hitler is born. So we cannot connect Wagner himself with the Nazis. It happens to be, though, that Wagner's son-in-law, then later his daughter-in-law, and then later even his grandsons are directly implicated in the Nazi regime. And that the Wagner theater under the Nazis becomes a kind of cult of Nazism. And a heavily racist and nationalist and anti-Semitic understanding of Wagner ensues. I mean, one basic one, just to give it away, if you haven't guessed it already, is that Alberich and the Nibelungen, the dwarfs, are sometimes seen as Jewish, as seen as a Jewish stereotype, that the Jews value money over love. And it's very much a part of the critique of capitalism. Even, Marx himself, by the way, came from a Jewish family. He actually came from a very distinguished line of rabbis on his father's side, but his father had to convert to Christianity to get a job as a lawyer. So Marx himself was baptized as a young boy. But Marx also writes a critique of Judaism based on capitalism, right? And Jews have a certain role within capitalism because Christians were not allowed to lend money at interest. So Jews do play a significant role in the rise of modern capitalist society. Now, what's unique about Wagner is that, first of all, he wrote his own, not only did he write his own libretti, he wrote his own manifestos about music, and he wrote one of the most significant anti-Semitic writings in modern Europe, an essay called Das Judentum in der Musik, Judaism in Music, which established modern anti-Semitism as a cultural discourse and explicitly attacked his mentor and predecessor, Giacomo Meyerbeer. So this is very complex because the most popular opera composer of Wagner's era was not Wagner, but it was his mentor, who had actually been a Jew from Germany, who ended up moving to France and became the most popular grand opera composer of his day. An interesting note that Meyerbeer, even though it's his last name, actually was his first and his last name. His first name was Meyer and his last name was Beer, and it became one word last name. And Meyerbeer actually was Wagner's mentor and actually helped Wagner in his early days. After he fled Germany after the revolution, he started in France, in Paris, where most musicians went to get their careers off the ground. And Meyerbeer himself tried to help Wagner, along with one other important composer who we already mentioned, Felix Mendelssohn, right? You might know him, of course. He wrote the Wedding March, dun, 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 as well as some fabulous oratorio and symphonies. And Mendelssohn, who died rather young, his music, if you like, the music itself, Wagner probably borrowed more from Mendelssohn than any other composer. So here you have the person Wagner borrows the most from and the mentor who tried to help him the most, and he turns on them. And this essay, even though it's attacking the Jews as a whole group, as a minority group, he singles out, he writes the name of Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer personally to attack them, and says that they're not original, that they steal from everyone, right? And this is what the Jews do. And this is a kind of projection, if you like. By the way, Wagner first writes this essay anonymously. It's republished at the end of his life with his name later. Now, Meyerbeer is important, not in the life of Wagner itself, but because he was the leading grand opera composer of the time, right? Grand opera, the form that Wagner rejects, the traditional 5-act form that often included recitative singing and ballet, but also was usually based on history, realism, right? Meyerbeer, if you like, was a realist. Not only did he write about real history, but his operas often serve to have a clear pedagogical aim. In other words, learning, a lesson, a moral or ethical lesson that was clear, not like in Wagner where you have to spend hours trying to analyze it and in a way almost like an archaeological dig, you have to uncover it. Meyerbeer had rather clear messages, and I just want to mention briefly two of his works. Fascinating, one thing when we talk about the other, right, even though that's often a term from 20th century philosophy, I basically mean it to indicate, the outsider, the excluded, the ostracized. That in other words, the inequality, the profit motive that are created by capitalism and industrialization often push people to look for scapegoats, outsiders, right, the other. The main other in Europe were the Jews. There really wasn't any other minority. You did have the Romani people, right? The incorrect term is gypsies, the Romani people, who were not were less numerous, less spread out in European society at the time. So basically, all the attention was on the Jewish population. Excuse me. And I'm just pointing to two of Meyerbeer's works, one called Le Prophète. He writes in French. And this is a work against religious fanaticism, against religious obscurantism, right? Anti-religion, almost, more rationalist enlightenment like Marx against religion. And then this other work, which in a way is a similar message, called Les Huguenots. And this is a story about, in a way, it's almost something like proto-genocide. It was perhaps the most famous case in Europe when a minority was exterminated, when they tried to murder, massacre, and exile a religious minority. This happens about a half a century before the French Revolution, plus in France, under Louis XIV, against the Protestants in France. Right? There used to be a significant Protestant population in France, but the state made a policy to eliminate them. Many were massacred, many fled. They ended up in Berlin also, but also in the New World and in England even. And Meyerbeer makes a powerful 5-act opera documenting this atrocity, this historical atrocity. And this, tension between Wagner and Meyerbeer reflects a clash of principles between racism and tolerance, capitalism and emancipation, which here impacted the history of music. What's amazing about Meyerbeer And let's read one of his quotes here, because Meyerbeer was very sensitive to racism because he had experienced it himself. This quote where he says, individuals can forget this word for a certain period of time, but not forever. But an assembled public can never forget it, for it takes only one to remember, and all revert to their prejudices. And what he's referring to, right, is words of opprobrium, denigration, basically a racist idea about the other. Now, one thing that's remarkable, I'll just share, is that Wagner is performed everywhere, all around the world. People travel around the world to watch ring cycles. He's probably the most famous, most written about composer in European history. I'm guilty of it myself because I also write about Wagner. And yet Meyerbeer, who was much more successful and famous than Wagner was in the time, is mostly forgotten. It's very hard to find any Meyerbeer to listen to or watch. And even Jewish scholars and writers who write a lot about Wagner, I'm shocked when I always search, whenever I get any one of these books, I immediately look, do they mention Meyerbeer? No. Not even as a footnote, not even as a negative counterpoint. Meyerbeer is written out of history. And this is not entirely due to Wagner, but one cannot discount the enormity of his contribution to the erasure of Meyerbeer. That being said, before we open up to some questions, I do want to share, let us look at one excerpt from the Huguenot, which dramatizes again it dramatizes the atrocity, the drama of the plight of the Huguenot, the French Protestants under the Catholic regime in France. Now, as we said, this is also an extremely long, almost 4-hour work. What I do want to show you is if you have any time, and you're not inclined to watch the entirety of this work, Act 4 is really where Meyerbeer shows in great detail the idea of a state plan, to attack and to purge and to massacre really this innocent, defenseless minority group. And in a way, it forms a template for all kinds of such, I wouldn't hesitate to use the term like proto-genocidal action, which of course then culminates in the 20th century in multiple genocides, the largest of which, of course, was the Holocaust against the Jewish population in Europe. I just want to see if I can I think I fast forwarded to Act 5. Yes. Okay, so let me just rewind. And of course, there is a love story at the heart of it. But okay. I think this will give you a sense of what I mean. Of course,
Professor, there's no sound from the video. I think you might have to unmute yourself first. I think.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. So sorry. I realized there was a problem with the mute button. Just as a brief introduction, again, this is from Act 4, and this truly is a kind of historicist, realist depiction of past action. You can see also the costumes are quite realistic, if you like, but this scene basically shows, the blessing of the soldiers who are going to go out and kill the defenseless Protestant minority. Okay, I want to leave time for questions here. I mean, you can see that the pedagogical idea is clearly communicated about the dangers of intolerance, right? The idea that a society, a state can come together and actually become so fanatical that they believe it is a just thing to murder innocent people, even a sacred duty, so to speak. And you can imagine, that this is a warning sign for growing intolerance within Europe, which of course Wagner contributed to. Okay, we're almost out of time. Are there any final thoughts or questions before we adjourn for the week? Okay, if not, next week we're moving on to nationalism, and there is also a nationalist interpretation of the ring. Remember that the gold is actually called the Rhine gold, which is the Rhine River, which is the kind of primal border of Germany, and that many characters in the ring will serve as nationalist heroes for Germany later. But the real era of nationalism in music as a genre really happens towards the end of Wagner's period. So we're going to move ahead another generation. We won't skip one, but we're going to basically be in the 1870s and 80s. And we'll look at nationalism both for small oppressed minorities, like the Czechs and the Finns, who are imprisoned in big empires, but also how nationalism begins to define itself vis-a-vis non-European groups, like specifically Orientalism, which in this context really meant more the Near East or the Middle East, North Africa, Egypt, or Central Asia. So we'll look at Egypt, and we'll look a little at Central Asia, what was known as Turkestan, essentially the Turkic Muslim part of Central Asia that the Russian Empire colonized in the 19th century. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll see you then. Have a great week and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics. Please send any questions to musicandpoliticspod, that's all one word, at gmail.com. musicandpoliticspod@gmail.com, and do seek us out on Patreon at Music and Politics Pod, again one word, where you can find membership that opens the door to curated reading and listening lists, as well as meetings and consultations with our team.